and on behalf of our project on China's global sharp power, I'd like to welcome you to this event in our regular speaker series. Today, our theme is More Than Sharp Power, how the CCP penetrates Taiwan and Hong Kong. You can learn a great deal about this subject in a new edited volume entitled China's Influence and the Center-Periphery Tug of War in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Indo-Pacific, which I'm holding right here. This includes contributions from nearly 24 distinguished scholars, including our guests, and to guide us through their findings, we are joined by Professors Andrew Nathan, Jieh-min, and Ma Ngok. Andrew Nathan is class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University. His teaching and research interests include Chinese politics and foreign policy, the comparative study of political participation and political culture, and human rights. Professor Nathan's books include Chinese Democracy, the Tiananmen Papers, and Will China Democratize, co-edited in part with our own Larry Diamond, who directs this project. Jieh-min is a research fellow at the Institute of Sociology, Academia Sinica, and served as a director at the Center for Contemporary China at National Tsinghua University in Taiwan. He is on the advisory committee of Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council and a former board member of the Straits Exchange Foundation. His research interests include political economy, political sociology, social movements, democratization, and civil society. And his books include Rent-Seeking Developmental State in China, Anaconda in the Chandelier, Mechanisms of Influence and Resistance in the China Factor. Ma Ngok is associate professor at the Department of Government and Public Administration at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He writes extensively on elections, party politics, democratization, and social movements in Hong Kong. He's the author of Political Development in Hong Kong, State, Political Society, and Civil Society, and more than 20 journal articles on Hong Kong politics. I'd like to welcome you all, but before turning the floor over to you, I'd like to remind the audience to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll turn to them in the final segment of the program. And without further delay, Andy, please lead us into the presentation.
Thank you, Glenn, very much. Well, I know that everybody listening to this program is very much aware of Chinese sharp power under the guidance of the Hoover Global Sharp Power Project and Larry and Glenn. Taiwan and Hong Kong are more important to China for Chinese influence than any of the other places that where we study their exercise of sharp power. These are two places that China is absolutely determined to control for very good security reasons of their own. And so it's in these places that the Chinese have made their greatest effort to exert influence through sharp power. And so it's very valuable for us to study how China exercises its sharp power in these two places. And that's what this book does. Can I have the next slide? So this is a table of contents of the book on this slide and the next slide. And what I want to draw your attention to are two sections of the book that are the core of it. The first of these two important sections is part 2 on this slide here, China's influence in peripheral autonomy, Hong Kong as a case study. This section of the book has 5 chapters by expert scholars located in Hong Kong. Ma Ngok is one of them, describing how China tries to exert influence. This is before the national security law was implemented, how China tried to exert influence in 5 domains of Hong Kong's life, including elections, the economy, media, entertainment, and religion. May I have the next slide? And part 3 of the book does the same thing for Taiwan. It has 5 chapters by distinguished scholars located in Taiwan, including our speaker today, Jieh-min, who's also one of the co-editors of this book, looking at China's influence efforts in the same 5 domains in Taiwan: elections, economy, media, entertainment, and religion. The rest of the chapters in the book, I think, are very good, if I may say so, but they're not the core. They provide historical context. They provide comparison to other China's influence efforts in other regions. There's a chapter at the end of the book by me on resistance to Chinese influence efforts around the world. And there's a final chapter by Richard Bush, one of probably the leading American specialist on U.S. Taiwan policy, on the American perspective. But the core are these two sections, each with 5 chapters detailing China's influence efforts in these two very important places. And with that, I want to pass over to Jieh-min to talk about the Taiwan case.
Secondly, I will very briefly define the modes of Chinese operations. Thirdly, I will introduce the 5 issue areas that our book has focused on through the Taiwan case. And finally, a few words about international comparison going beyond Taiwan and Hong Kong. So one is more than the sharp power. Quintessentially, the Chinese power play is a routinized united front work. The united front work as a magic weapon of the CCP is carried out to an extreme extent, penetrating every corner of the target society, as we can see from the Hong Kong and Taiwan cases. To achieve such a degree of penetration, the CCP must use local people and local organizations to work for them. Some of them may unwittingly fulfill the function. Still, most people are doing their job in exchange for material rewards. So a whole bunch of local people are organized as kind of cooperators or collaborators. This widespread collaborative network in the target society therefore becomes an essential part of the Chinese influence operations. This element makes the Chinese model distinct from the Russian model. Next, please. This slide shows the 3 modes of influence operations we define in the book. The first one is on the left-hand side is external coercion. It's direct pressuring, which is more conventional and relates to high politics. In the center, it's the penetration from within. By contrast, is an indirect operation by way of the local collaborators. And finally, the mode of eroding political boundaries, which is a mixed strategy. Next, please. We have worked on the 5 issue areas, including election, tourism, media, entertainment, and religion. We have 2 chapters for each, as Andy just introduced, one for Hong Kong and another for Taiwan. Next, please. Elections. First, China has interfered in every Taiwan national election since 1996. That is quite early. Its method basically has changed from direct military intimidation into indirect pressuring. Since 2005, the year that the CCP and the KMT Kuomintang in Taiwan began to cooperate with each other, there have been high-level official exchanges between the CCP and the KMT. As you can see from these photos, I don't have time to introduce them one by one. Remarkably, the exchanges are not limited to politicians, but include religions and many other social actors. Next, please. This is in the Boao Forum 2018. Xi Jinping talked to a delegation of business people. They are very top leaders of the business from Taiwan, led by Vincent Hsu. Vincent Hsu is the former vice president of Taiwan, and his party identity is Kuomintang, of course. Mr. Hsu has been a central figure for high-level exchange across the Taiwan Strait over the last 2 decades. Next, please. The most dramatic united front work for the CCP, and it is the most successful operation so far, is the 1992 consensus campaign during Taiwan's presidential election in 2012. In this campaign, scores of tycoons stood up for the 1992 consensus. This chart, you can see, shows 5 waves of the 1992 consensus campaigns over the last 2 decades. The last 3 waves match the electoral cycles. This so-called consensus is just like a political mantra being recited over and over by the KMT politicians without an end. Next, please. Tourism is a crucial leverage for the CCP to affect Taiwanese politics. The Chinese government controls the outbound tour groups to regulate the supply towards the target country. This measure can quickly nurture a constituency that depends on mainland tourism. This figure shows a clear trend of Chinese supply to Taiwan. The dramatic uphill, can you see from the top line, the dramatic uphill was to celebrate the KMT's electoral victory over the DPP since 2008. And when the DPP regained power, Beijing slashed its tourist supply to pressure Taiwan again. Next, please. The Arabia-Qadir affair is the very first instance of sanction by using tourism from Beijing. It happened as early as 2009. Arabia-Qadir was an exiled Uyghur leader. The Kaohsiung city government sponsored an international film festival, which scheduled a documentary featuring Qadir. Beijing was so upset that it demanded the Kaohsiung government scrap the Qadir film. Otherwise, it would cut the supply of tour groups to Kaohsiung. The DPP mayor, who is Chen Ju, a veteran Democrat, decided not to give in, so she paid a high political cost. Next, please. Chinese control of the media around the world has been notorious. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, it goes almost unbridled. Chinese easy money has poured into Taiwan. Petty news, censorship, and the disinformation are daily phenomena for us. The picture shows that Wang Yang met with a Taiwanese media delegation. Wang Yang, the head of United Front Work, told the Taiwanese media bosses that their news reports should be in line with the party's official ideology. We won't see that kind of thing happen for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Even in a horrid situation with Australia's ABC and BBC, which were exposed a couple of years ago, that kind of operation wouldn't be so reckless and flagrant. Next, please. What is spectacular is the combination of disinformation warfare and wolf warrior diplomacy by the CCP. In 2018, a typhoon damaged Japan's Kansai airport. Beijing seized it to wage a propaganda war against Taiwan. The Taiwanese diplomats in Japan were depicted as unresponsive and incompetent compared with the Chinese wolf warriors. This incident led to a tragedy that a high-rank Taiwanese diplomat committed suicide under tremendous pressure. The Kansai airport incident clearly indicates that the Chinese model of disinformation warfare is different from the Russian one. Next slide, please. The Russian model is quite well studied, so I skip it here. The Chinese model starts and ends in the same mechanism as the Russians, but in between the operation process, it musters a large army of local collaborative agencies, including mainstream media outlets, bosses, journalists, editors, and so on. Without the deep-rooted collaborative network, the CCP wouldn't have been able to convert a natural disaster in Japan into a political crisis for the DPP government in Taiwan. The Chinese growing market and influence in the global entertainment industry have brought significant outcomes. The PRC captured this sector to censor the entertainers and producers and the directors just to sway people's political identity. A Taiwanese singer, Zhou Ziyi, you can see from the photo here, who is very popular in South Korea. She is Taiwanese. She is working in South Korean K-pop. She apologized to the Chinese government and the netizens for waving the ROC or Taiwan flag with the Korean flag. The city has organized for information warfare and for the witch hunt for Taidu or Taiwan independence advocacy entertainers. They believe so, but actually they may not be as Taidu supporters, actually. Likewise, the CCP can also weaponize the apps such as TikTok and WeChat. Next, please. Religion. Temples are Taiwan's cultural and local political centers. Most large temples are controlled by local factions and religious notables, so they become targets for Chinese United Front work. This slide shows that a Maju Temple, Zhennan-gong in Taichung, Middle Taiwan, becomes a key post for the CCP officials to penetrate the grassroots. The table on the right, which I compiled, lists an itinerary of CCP officials. They visited 18 temples during a 2-week tour. Zhennan-gong was the facilitator for this trip. This kind of pilgrimage provides the Chinese officials with excellent avenues to investigate Taiwan's grassroots and cultivate networks. During the 2016 presidential election, a high-level official visited Taiwan several days before voting. He went straight to Zhennan-gong and convened a secret meeting with 29 neighborhood heads in the district, and he told them whom to support. What is, people may be curious, what is the payback for such collaboration from the religious notables and religious bosses, local factions? According to our research, the chapter on religion in the book, local bosses can gain a religious bonus. And this kind of bonus is realized mostly in huge land development profits. These photos show that a top Taiwan affairs official, Zheng Lizhong, toured around the island, and he was welcomed everywhere by the cooperative religious bosses and local politicians. Next, please. Now my conclusion. The Taiwan case can apply to other countries and religions. There was a THAAD missile dispute between South Korea and China several years ago. Once South Korea decided to deploy the missiles, Beijing began its economic sanctions. Its measures including cutting the tourist groups to South Korea, banning the K-pop performances in China, forcing the Lord Group. Lord Group provides a land strip for the deployment site. So Beijing forced the Lord Group to close its supermarkets, more than 100 in China, and so on. So we found that these sanctions are so strikingly similar to what Beijing has done to Taiwan before. And later we discovered that the same operation was applied to Australia just last year. I won't go into details about the operations in many other countries for the sake of time. It suffices to say that our framework makes a step forward for the study of sharp power, authoritarian diffusion, and the pushbacks by the target country, by the people who are influenced by the Chinese sharp power. Finally, the weapon of the weapons utilized by the CCP is that an approach that I called commercialization of the United Front work. The exchange between the Chinese and the foreign partners is purely commercial, mutually beneficial, and innocuous on the surface. But when you probe deeper, you can always dig out the political motivations on the Chinese side beneath. Okay, I will stop here and pass the microphone to Professor Ngok. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will share my own PowerPoint. Thanks for giving me this chance to talk about Hong Kong. And there are 5 chapters on Hong Kong, and my chapter is mostly on Hong Kong elections. I'm sorry to say that actually a lot of what I had written was kind of outdated because most of the chapter was written, and most of the chapters are actually written before 2019, before the anti-extradition protest. But I think the other chapters are still largely okay, the framework, but elections in Hong Kong change a lot after that. Hong Kong is different from Taiwan and other countries, peripheral countries mentioned in the book in terms of like South Asia, Central Asia, is that Hong Kong is under the direct sovereignty control of China. So as far as elections is concerned, actually the all constitutional changes in Hong Kong towards full democratization need the approval of Beijing. And my historical accounts show that Beijing actually intervened twice before 2019, that was in terms of rewriting electoral rules in 1998 and 2012. But actually, Beijing can make their own rules for Hong Kong from Beijing, and that was what happened in 2020. And then, but actually, in 2016 and 2017, they intervened to disqualify elected legislators in 2016 and 2017 by interpretation of the Basic Law. In essence, because some of them shouted derogatory slogans when they were taking the oath of office. And then in the end, 6 opposition legislators were disqualified because of this interpretation of the Basic Law. But that was just the beginning. And then we all in Hong Kong, I have been studying elections in Hong Kong for some years. And China has been the most important factor in Hong Kong elections because of its indirect influence in terms of, first of all, the attitude to Beijing and the attitude to democratization of Hong Kong, human rights in Hong Kong have been the major political cleavage in Hong Kong elections since popular elections were introduced to the legislature since 1991. So for those of you who do not understand the current situation of Hong Kong after 1997, we had about half of the legislature popularly elected by one person, one vote. And the other half was elected by functional constituencies, which are mostly representative of major business and professional groups, of which most people do not have a vote. The chief executive is elected by an election committee of about 700 people, which are mostly under the influence of Beijing. So, but Beijing still wields its indirect influence. And this is actually a very important part of my chapter. That is by co-optation of business professional elites and so-called United Front. And then they managed to build a very strong patron-client network in Hong Kong that comprised of various unions, residential associations, other so-called mass groups, including women's groups, youth groups. They organize a lot of different activities, give out gifts, and that became a kind of a very powerful mobilizational machine during elections. And then they register the members into to become voters, and then mobilize them to campaign. So actually, these was actually very effective in local elections, in district council elections, in the sense that those elections will be less ideological, more about local benefits, and then the patron-client mobilization was more effective. So this is one thing that I try to emphasize in my book chapter. That was the pro-Beijing forces were gradually gaining ground before 2019. That was their vote share in popular elections were gradually increasing from what was about 25% in 1997 to gradually 40 to 45% before 2019. This is another special thing about Hong Kong, is that the pro-democracy opposition has been getting a majority of popular votes in elections, but just that because not the whole legislature was popularly elected. So they were kind of in a kind of a permanent minority status, getting about 40% of the seats in the legislature. So the other areas, I would be brief here. Tourism, entertainment business, media, they had similar situation in that the China market was so important. A lot of those businessmen who are engaged in these areas, actually they had to cater for the position of China. And China's capital is so dominant in Hong Kong. So for a lot of the businessmen, they do not want to, they have to kind of adopt a more conservative pro-Beijing position. And a lot of self-censorship going on in the media, with the very exception of maybe Jieh-min's group. And then there's limited local resistance, and also the church as well. There was a lot of criticisms in Hong Kong against the mainstream churches, including the Catholic, the Vatican being silent on Hong Kong's issues, and then because they were largely loath to oppose Beijing for a number of years. But a lot of these still, I would say, still hold true. That wasn't changed much after 2019. But 2019 was a major game changer. As far as I can concern, this is not covered in the book, but I feel obliged to actually do some supplement here. And the anti-extradition bill movement, which lasted for several months, changed everything, in the sense that it was seen as a kind of a separatist movement by Beijing. And also Beijing was very unhappy about Hong Kong politicians and activists going all over the world to the US and then to lobby for Western sanctions. So they feel that they need to stop that. And then in November 2019, there was the local election, district council elections, and it brought a landslide victory of the Democrats, which enabled them to win 86% of the total seats, and which was unprecedented. Before that, they hold about 30% of the seats in the local elections. And then we were supposed to have a legislative council election in 2020 September, but that was postponed with the pretext of the pandemic. And then they were the first of the Democrats really winning a majority in the 2020 legislative council elections, even with the limited election model. So what happened was Beijing stepped in to use more direct influence because they understand that even with all the money that they put in with the powerful patron-client framework, that it was kind of overwhelmed by the political tide in 2019. Because in the 2019 district council election, it was a historical high voter turnout of 71%. In the past, it was usually about 40–45% of the voter turnout. So a lot of people, they were afraid that the 2020 legislative council election would be a repeat of this. So what they do is that, of course, they enacted the electoral security law in June 2020. And then which was, I guess some of you, and then they postponed the September 2020 elections. So what did happen is they disqualified 4 pro-democracy legislators in November 2020. directly from Beijing. So the Democrats in protest, actually, originally there were about 25 of them. They pull out of legislative council altogether because the ones that who were elected in 2016 were supposed to serve until 2020, and then but then the election was postponed. They were given 1 extra year, but then the 4 of them were deemed unpatriotic, and then they were not seen as supportive of the Basic Law, so they were disqualified. And then the Democrats in protest full of electorals. So actually, the currently serving legislature, almost we can say that there was no opposition in the legislature. And then 55 opposition candidates who participated in a primary of the Democratic camp were arrested in January 2021 on charges of subversion, because 36 of them were denied bail and they are still in custody. Because Beijing saw that the campaign to try to seize a majority in Hong Kong, in the legislature in Hong Kong, and then maybe vetoing the budget, trying to veto a budget to force a constitutional crisis as subversive. So, and then what was more is the direct change of the electoral system that was handed down in March this year. So the National People's Congress decided to change the electoral system for Hong Kong. And this is one thing which show the actual direct influence of Beijing, very different from other peripheral countries, is that they can hand down decisions directly from Beijing, and then Hong Kong as a local place has no way to constitutionally to resist. And then the directly elected seats were reduced from 1/2 of the legislature to 20. So, and then the 40 of the new seats would be elected by an election committee that elects the chief executive, which means that Beijing will be most likely to control the majority of the election committee. And then they were building in multiple screening mechanisms in the name that they think that now it is very important that the patriots should be ruling Hong Kong, so-called 爱国者治港. And then so they built in a screening committee. Every candidate needs to be get approved by a screening committee, and then they have to take an oath to swear allegiance to the Basic Law and then and the SAL government, and then they need to get nominations from the election committee members, different sectors of the election committee members, making it very difficult actually for the pro-democracy opposition candidates to be able to enter the race. So I'm using up my time here. So the change of franchise in the election committee is also making it more difficult for the Democrats to contest in the future elections. So this is what is new. We are supposed to have an election, legislative council election in December 2021, but this is a totally new change in terms of the electoral system in Hong Kong, showing the direct influence of China on Hong Kong. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you all for those great presentations. I'd like to start the next few minutes of conversation with you with a question for Professor Ma. And that is, many of the changes that you've just described for us are electoral changes, some of which have not yet taken effect because they're prospective, though they augur very poorly for the state of Taiwan's democracy and the leadership that Beijing installs in Hong Kong. But I wanted to ask you if you could widen the scope a little bit and update us as to what is happening outside of the political system with respect to educational reforms, attacks on the professional bar, for example, arrests, trials, and how Hong Kong society is struggling to hold on to the freedoms and liberties that it had enjoyed for a great many years in the face of this political shift in power and the more aggressive assertion of PRC power in the city. What kind of resistance is there? Is there pushback? And what is slipping?
We are struggling to be frank, because I think the chilling effect of the national security law is just very strong. And then we are still under very tough social distance rules in Hong Kong. So any social gathering of more than 4 people would be struck with a fine of about 5,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is about 700, 800 US dollars. And then, but incredibly, Hong Kong is down to single digits of daily infections. Can you imagine if we are a kind of 7 million people city, and then we are down to single digits of infections every day, but then we still have very tough social distance rules. So I would say there was a lot of chilling effect with because the national security law was so broad, and then the penalty is very heavy, and then those who are arrested can be denied bail, and then which is in effect in detention. So it posed a major difficulty for civil society. So for the time being, a lot of people, and there was a lot of talk about immigration in Hong Kong, which is it induced a kind of a sense of helplessness, which doesn't bode well for all kinds of movement. So there are small groups who are still doing resistance in a kind of a mode of everyday resistance, but actually for a short period of time, I don't see a major resistance movement or massive movement as you can witness on TV that happens in 2019 happening. Of course, we still have some of the limited freedom. The affidavit is still being published, and then it is still very critical. And then, but we are also afraid that a lot of different of these freedoms will be diminished gradually. Because especially there will be weaker check and balance with the absence of an opposition in the legislature. And then, so this is going to be difficult.
What is your sense of how this has affected universities and what faculty are comfortable talking about and teaching?
I don't know, because different people have different calculations. Because I sometimes find it funny, because sometimes it seems that overseas universities are more concerned about talking about China, whereas we are talking about China and Hong Kong politics every day in classrooms. And I take more of my classes, because these days I would say that there's no way that you can forbid people taping your lecture. Actually, whenever you put things online. So, but I would say there was major chilling effect on the freedom of speech in Hong Kong, and then and also academic freedom, and then because we are kind of worried. A lot of people are kind of worried about some, for example, some kind of international exchanges. And then whether or not that would hurt, that would be seen as collaborating with foreign powers, and then what you are supposed to say, what you are not allowed to say, and these are something that kind of atmosphere that I think has been induced in Hong Kong in recent years. In recent months, I would say, I think about 1 year.
Thank you very much. For Professor Wu, I have a question. You know, like Hong Kong, there are segments of Taiwanese society that actually genuinely favor very close, if not full integration with, very close relations, if not full integration with the PRC. In a pluralistic society, how do you tolerate those points of view and separate collaborators from people who genuinely favor very close ties with the PRC? As Professor Ma has pointed out, there, you know, are segments of the of Hong Kong that are organized and actually, you know, genuinely favor close ties with mainland China. In Taiwan, there are those people as well. So in a pluralistic society, how do you strike that balance between respecting their positions and also tackling the problem of influence and collaboration?
Okay, thank you. Sure, we know that Taiwan is a young democracy, but Taiwan has consolidated its democracy, and also Taiwan's judicial system is quite independent from the parties and from other social influences. So as you say, Taiwan has been a very pluralistic society, but Taiwan, there's a deep political split or cleavage among the people, among society, just like in the States. We have a pan-green group, and we also have pan-blue camp. And if we analyze them, collect them into two parts in terms of votes, the proportion is about 6 to 4. Okay, that's vote base. But in Taiwan, actually, there's quite a few people who are genuinely identified with the Chinese political values and the Chinese nationalist ideology. And I would say that proportion is maybe as low as 10% or fewer. Okay, so but there are still some people more than 10 are willing to do business with the Chinese market, and they think the Chinese market is a great opportunity that we cannot miss out. Okay, so Beijing is very clever to take advantage of this motivation to do business with those people and to deliver it's good in exchange for political gains. Okay, so how to strike the balance, I would say it's very difficult. And because I'm a member of the civil society, I joined many social movements to protest against the Chinese influence over the last decade. So I think a balancing power from Taiwan is the civil society, especially as the ruling party is more or like pro-China, all right? But now, since DPP, that is more local rooted, so we can see there's a quite good synergy between the government, the civil society, civic groups, and also the cyber experts to ward off the very fierce everyday attack from the disinformation sphere. Okay, so that is generally that is the situation in Taiwan. And finally, I can give you a side note about the difficulty of striking balance. The court just ruled that several young people were not guilty for cooperating and receiving money from the Chinese agents on the mainland. They applied some age-old legal articles, and the court says that they are not guilty. So this case, make a splash in Taiwan society, and still, is still making some side effect and push us, to think deeper about reforming our legal system, especially against the Chinese aggression.
Thank you. Yes, it's in the nature of democracies that they struggle to meet the challenge of especially united front work, because it exploits the openness of our societies. For Professor Nathan, I have a question. In some ways, Hong Kong and Taiwan are special cases. Their societies have unequaled ethnic, linguistic, and cultural ties to mainland China, and they're at the top, really, of the CCP's list of core strategic interests. Even so, you could say that they also prove the limits of CCP influence. And that has forced the PRC to essentially escalate by taking more assertive measures in both places. What lessons should the rest of the world then draw from their experiences about not just the possibilities of CCP influence, but also the limitations?
In my chapter in the volume, I looked at various forms of CCP influence, including the Belt and Road Initiative, where they have an estimated $1 trillion of commitments to invest in infrastructure in 80 countries, including countries that trade with China and so forth. And what I the basic pattern I found is that in every country, there's a faction that's pro-China and there's a faction that's anti-China. And it's often the people in government who are pro-China because they've got a good deal with China to build something and they're getting a loan, and probably in many countries some corrupt side payments. And then it's the opposition that's critical. But when the opposition comes to power, they often switch around and do a deal with China. So Malaysia was a great example of that, where the Najib government was criticized by the opposition led by Mahathir for their corrupt dealings with China and taking too big of a debt. And then when Mahathir said, I'll get rid of that, when he came back in, he went to China and struck a deal with the Chinese. So Chinese presence is controversial every place. That the economic element that Jieh-min emphasizes is very important in those dynamics, because money talks, and the United States and other actors, Japan and others, don't have the same scale of money to put into other countries that China has. But then again, the sort of rapid rise of Chinese power, their wolf warrior diplomacy, is perceived as sort of aggressive. And so that also causes a certain amount of shock and pushback in a lot of countries. So the picture is complicated.
Thank you. I want to turn to the question and answer segment of our program now, and first to Larry Diamond.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thank you all three for these great presentations, the really important book, and to Professor Ma, the superb and deeply distressing update on the situation. I want to ask a little bit different version of what Glenn has asked, and very specifically, in this respect, what lessons Taiwan might draw from the trajectory of postures that the PRC has manifested toward Hong Kong. Of course, we hasten to stress, Hong Kong was in the one country, two systems framework. Taiwan is not. They're trying to draw Taiwan into it. But, they had applied one country, two systems. They had a treaty-like obligation not to touch Hong Kong's autonomy for 50 years, and it didn't work out so well. They acted to suppress that much sooner than some people thought they would. That is, well short of the 50-year time frame. And it seemed like, and your presentation suggests, China has gone through a kind of escalation of tactics, from soft power to sharp power. Nothing worked in Hong Kong, and in fact, it looked like they were losing control. Popular protests were increasing. Pro-democracy forces were getting more votes, and they finally just said, "The heck with it. We're going to use force," and they used it in a more incremental way, actually, than I thought they would. But do you think that we should draw a similar lesson with respect to Taiwan, that if they decide that the alternation and graduation of soft power, united front, and sharp power tactics is leading nowhere, that they're only, despite all their different measures, Taiwan is simply becoming more and more permanently lost, that they'll just make a similar pivot toward a much more dramatic implementation of their will with respect to Taiwan?
Actually, I don't know the answer to this question, because I think that the game plan of Beijing was working very well before 2019. Actually, a lot of Hong Kong people were pessimistic in the different sense, because I think they are actually gradually increasing the control, and then it seems that the vote share of the pro-Beijing groups were increasing actually before 2019. But then, of course, 2019 changed everything, and then interesting thing is that I think the 2019 protests actually flew off the game plan with Taiwan as well, because they were being successful when Han Kuo-yu was elected the Kaohsiung mayor, and then they were looking good in terms of the KMT winning the presidential election. But then I think to me the Hong Kong situation actually enabled the DPP to win the presidential election. And then it seems that everything changed in terms of Taiwan people's impression on China, etc. So I do not know to what extent are they serious about the military option. It seems not conceivable in the sense of the like China peacefully rising with all the talk, and then the original situation was kind of favorable to them. But I would say Hong Kong is different from Taiwan in that respect, in terms of they do have direct control on Hong Kong. But I do believe that actually by using a lot of these sharp power, and then direct influence, actually it is not serving the best interest of Beijing. In terms of like, I would say the one country, two systems is there to show the Western world that Hong Kong is still a good place for business. But then by doing away with all these elections, etc., actually in terms of a kind of a show window to Taiwan, and also the show window to the world, Western world, and that has not served the best interest of Beijing. So actually, I think they are kind of hesitant in a lot of different measures. But of course, it is already very tough on Hong Kong for the time being.
Yeah, the Hong Kong one country system is no more a demonstration window for Taiwan. No chance about that. And in the anti-extradition law protest 2 years ago, Hong Kong became a lesson for Taiwan. So there was a slogan by the youth taking to the streets. They say that yesterday, today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan. So we stand up and resist the influence, resist the negative, the ill wind from blowing from the mainland. So that support to Hong Kong indirectly also upholds the support rate for President Tsai Ing-wen's re-election to some extent. And I would like to add that Hong Kong and Taiwan are two very different cases in historical perspective. These two places are going on opposite trajectories. Taiwan has emerged from a very authoritarian setting. We had only very low level election 50 years ago, and little by little we have gathered momentum from the electoral mobilization one after another, and we had a breakthrough in the mid-60s. And after almost 35 40 years, we consolidated the democracy. And when you look at Taiwan, by contrast, you look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been a so-called mixed regime, okay, a part of democracy and a very full guarantee of liberty and freedoms, and also a semi-democratic system during the later days of British rule, okay? And it spilled over to the early days of Chinese rule. And that didn't change for almost 15 years. But over the last decade, especially since the movement in 2012, the high school students hunger strike against the patriotic education program. I think since that moment, the Chinese leaders have changed their frame. They have changed their mind frame, and they decided kind of to change from the soft power into hard power and into repression, and finally they impose the national security law. So the trajectory of the two societies are so different.
Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, but a colleague of ours at FSI, Tom Finger, has asked a very interesting question that I'd like to pose to Professor Wu. So I wonder if you could answer it briefly. And that is, have CCP influence efforts impeded or accelerated and strengthened Taiwan's transformation from one-party authoritarianism to democracy? And have those efforts moderated or accelerated the deterioration of PRC relations with countries like Australia, Canada, and the BRI? So, for example, has the pressure from the PRC helped or hindered Taiwan's democratization?
Okay, this is a very interesting question. It's a paradox. For some skeptics or pro-China people, they say that if you argue that the Chinese negative influence is affecting Taiwan's domestic politics, how could you argue that our democracy has been consolidated and improving? But just because the success of the United Front work, United Front measures, and the people feel the power of Chinese the penetration, so the people are awakened to resist, to push back those influences. Okay, so just as Professor Ma cited the 2018 local 9-1 local elections, during those elections, the KMT clearly defeated DPP, and they look like they're poised to win the presidential election, within 1 year. But how come the DPP can make a fight back to push back the influence from China? It's because the awakening of the people. So this kind of influence interaction pattern is not an objective scientific law. It always needs the human agency to explain the outcome. Okay, so I think in final analysis, I think the China factor operating in Taiwan inevitably strengthen our democracy so far.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. And I'd like to thank you all for a magnificent set of presentations. I'd also like to remind the audience that the book is available if you'd like it. I'll show it to you again here. And I'd be remiss if I didn't draw your attention to the next event in our series on May 24th, where former British diplomat Roger Garside and human rights lawyer Tang Biao will discuss towards a democratic China, what role can outsiders play? Mr. Garside himself has just published a new book entitled China Coup that sparked tremendous interest, and I hope you'll join us. Until then, thank you and be well.